A desperate palace released a heavily doctored photograph of the Princess of Wales, igniting explosive global rumors that she was secretly missing, locked away, or perhaps living a dark double life that the Crown was terrified to reveal. We must cast our minds back to the genesis of this extraordinary debacle, to those frigid, unforgiving weeks following Christmas 2023, when the usually ubiquitous Catherine simply vanished from the public eye without a single whisper of explanation. For an institution built entirely on the currency of visibility, where the sovereign and his heirs must be seen to be believed, this abrupt erasure was not merely an oversight, it was a profound breach of the unwritten contract forged between the monarchy and the British people. The sudden, jarring nature of her disappearance set the stage for an unprecedented crisis of faith, plunging the entire royal apparatus into a suffocating paranoia. We are not merely discussing a bout of ill health, we are dissecting a catastrophic failure of communication that exposed the brittle, deeply panicked reality lurking just beneath the polished veneer of Kensington Palace. Imagine, if you will, the claustrophobic atmosphere within the administrative offices, where meticulously planned overseas tours and carefully curated charity engagements were suddenly obliterated with the stroke of a pen, replaced by a deafening, heavy silence that spoke volumes to those paying attention. Junior staff members, usually tasked with maintaining an impossible facade of serene normalcy, found themselves utterly paralyzed by the lack of clear directives, their creeping dread amplifying with every passing hour of absolute secrecy. The usual well-oiled machinery of the royal calendar ground to a shuddering, violent halt, leaving a vacuum of truth that the palace naively believed they could control through sheer force of will, entirely underestimating the ravenous appetite of the modern media landscape. When the inevitable announcement finally materialized in mid-January, disguised as a routine update about a supposedly planned abdominal surgery, it possessed all the hallmarks of a rushed, deeply flawed crisis management strategy. The phrasing itself was a masterclass in obfuscation, attempting to sanitize a clearly traumatic and unexpected medical emergency into a serene, scheduled procedure, a linguistic sleight of hand that immediately insulted the intelligence of the global public. Prince William, a man famously burdened by the ghosts of media intrusions past, undoubtedly drove this fiercely protective, yet ultimately self-destructive narrative of absolute lockdown, prioritizing his wife's immediate privacy over the long-term credibility of the crown. One can almost picture the tense, hushed arguments within his private chambers, the furious rejection of any transparency, driven by a deeply ingrained suspicion of the press that often borders on the obsessive. This stubborn refusal to offer even a morsel of genuine context created a suffocating pressure cooker environment, transforming what should have been an outpouring of national sympathy into a breeding ground for relentless, dark speculation. This grim, defensive posture from Kensington Palace stood in jarring, almost humiliating contrast to the surprising transparency emanating simultaneously from Buckingham Palace regarding King Charles's own health battles. The King's team, seemingly recognizing that we no longer live in an era where sovereigns can simply retreat behind castle walls and pull up the drawbridge, offered a candidness that made William and Catherine's silence appear all the more sinister and archaic. While across the Atlantic, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex were predictably continuing their tiresome, self-serving PR games, demanding privacy while simultaneously thrusting themselves in front of any available camera, the future King and Queen of England were achieving a far more dangerous kind of isolation. Their strategy was not merely a public relations blunder, it was a profound misreading of the room, a devastating failure to comprehend that in the digital age, a total blackout of information is immediately interpreted as an admission of guilt, or worse, tragedy. The long-term consequences of this isolationist approach were already taking root, permanently fracturing the delicate trust that had taken decades to rebuild following the turbulent years of the late 90s. Deep within the velvet-lined walls, the psychological toll of orchestrating this monumental cover-up began to silently destroy the morale of the very people tasked with defending the royal brand. Courtiers who had dedicated their lives to the service of the crown found themselves trapped in an agonizing moral twilight, forced to peddle a narrative of calm reassurance while acutely aware of the deeply troubling reality playing out away from the cameras. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken anxieties and hushed whispers, a toxic environment where loyalty was tested not by one's dedication to the monarch, but by one's ability to maintain a straight face while lying by omission to the global press corps. The sheer arrogance of assuming the public would simply nod along and wait patiently for Easter without asking a single uncomfortable question highlights a terrifying disconnect between the modern royals and the people they are destined to rule. They had unwittingly constructed a golden cage of their own making, locking away the truth and inadvertently inviting the entire world to peer through the bars, desperate to uncover the dark secrets they believed were being hidden within. For the loyal traditionalists, the very backbone of the monarchy's support who have followed this family through every triumph and scandal, this stony silence felt like a deeply personal betrayal, a sudden severing of an emotional bond that had been carefully cultivated for over a decade. Imagine the quiet dismay in drawing rooms and over garden fences across the nation, where sensible, intelligent observers were forced to confront the chilling possibility that the glowing, uncomplaining princess they had come to admire was perhaps buckling under an unimaginable internal pressure. The longer the void persisted, the more the palace's polished, impenetrable facade began to crack, allowing the most salacious, cynical whispers to seep into the mainstream consciousness, transforming polite concern into ravenous, unstoppable gossip. The courtiers failed to grasp that human nature inherently abhors a vacuum, and by providing absolutely no credible narrative, they effectively surrendered the global conversation to internet sleuths, opportunists, and malicious actors who were all too eager to write the script themselves. This was the precise moment the institution lost control of its own history, trading the dignified, age-old strategy of stoic silence for a catastrophic perception of guilt, cover-up, and frantic, flailing desperation. As the frost of January yielded to the bitter, unforgiving winds of February, the realization dawned on the most senior aides that they were entirely out of their depth, navigating an unprecedented crisis with an antiquated map that had long since lost its relevance. The complete erasure of the future queen consort from the global stage had evolved from a temporary medical necessity into an existential threat to the very fabric of the Windsor legacy, exposing a deeply uncomfortable truth about the fragility of their power. The inner monologue of those in command must have been one of stark, terrifying clarity. The protective wall they had built around Catherine had inadvertently become a prison of public suspicion, trapping the entire family in a scandal of their own design. The stage was irrevocably set for a disastrous series of unforced errors, driven by a profound, agonizing desperation to reclaim a narrative that had already slipped permanently through their fingers. The silence had not protected the princess. It had merely primed the detonator for the explosive, humiliating spectacle that was about to unfold on the global stage. The vacuum of truth created by the palace in those long gray weeks of February 2024 was not merely an oversight, it was a fertile breeding ground for the most grotesque and imaginative fictions the digital age has ever birthed. We watched, with a mix of fascination and burgeoning dread, as the global conversation shifted from polite concern to a feral, unchecked hunt for the real Catherine, while the men in gray suits at Kensington Palace remained inexplicably, stubbornly silent. One could almost feel the temperature dropping within the royal offices as the realization dawned that their no-comment policy was being treated not as a request for privacy, but as a provocative challenge by a public that felt increasingly gaslit. This was the era of Kategate, a digital storm where every grainy frame of past footage was forensically analyzed for clues of a marriage in crisis, a mental breakdown, or far more sinister disappearances that the Crown was supposedly desperate to sanitize. The irony, of course, was that by attempting to protect the princess's dignity, they had instead surrendered her identity to the whims of the most cynical corners of the internet, allowing her life to be rewritten as a gothic thriller. Prince William's internal monologue during this period must have been a tempest of protective fury and a chilling underlying helplessness as he watched his wife's reputation being torn apart by the very medium he has spent a lifetime loathing. We know from a source within the inner circle that the prince's frustration was simmering at a near boiling point, his natural instinct to withdraw into the fortress of Windsor, only serving to feed the beast he so desperately wanted to starve. There is a particular suffocating kind of pressure that comes with being the future king when you realize that the old rules of engagement, the ones your grandmother mastered over 7 decades, are utterly useless against a viral hashtag. He was trapped between his duty to the institution, which demanded a visible, stable heir, and his visceral need to shield his recovering wife from a world that seemed to have lost its collective mind. This siege mentality took a firm hold behind the closed doors of Adelaide Cottage, creating an atmosphere of us against the world that, while perhaps romantically noble, was strategically disastrous for a modern monarchy that survives solely on public consent. The contrast with the king's household became a source of quiet, biting friction that threatened to split the royal PR apparatus right down the middle, exposing a lack of unified leadership at the very top. While King Charles was being photographed waving from the back of his state Bentley, providing a steady, reassuring pulse of business as usual, despite his own cancer diagnosis, the Wales's camp appeared like a ghost ship, adrift and unresponsive. Someone close to palace circles has hinted that the king's men were privately exasperated by the radio silence from Kensington Palace, fearing that William's obsession with total privacy was dragging the entire family into a reputational abyss. The surrounding atmosphere at Buckingham Palace was one of pragmatic transparency, a calculated gamble to keep the public on side, whereas at Windsor, the air was thick with a defiant, almost arrogant secrecy that felt dangerously out of step with the times. This was not just a difference in PR styles, it was a fundamental clash of philosophies between an aging monarch who understands the necessity of the royal show and a younger heir who seems increasingly resentful of the stage itself. As February bled into March, the internet stepped into the void with a vengeance, spawning terrifying, morbid conspiracy theories that would have been dismissed as madness only a few years prior. We saw the rise of the amateur body language expert and the digital forensics hobbyist, people who spent hours dissecting old photographs to prove that Catherine had been replaced by a double, or, more chillingly, that she was no longer with us at all. The long-term consequences of this period cannot be overstated. It was the moment the public learned that they didn't need the BBC or the Times to tell them what was happening at the palace. They could simply invent a more compelling version themselves. The Crown lost its status as the sole narrator of its own story, a loss of power that is perhaps the most significant threat to the monarchy since the abdication. The palace's belief that they could simply wait it out was a catastrophic miscalculation, as every day of silence was interpreted by the masses as another day of a cover-up, cementing a narrative of deception that would prove nearly impossible to erase. One cannot help but spare a cynical thought for the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, who must have watched this unfolding chaos from their Californian enclave with a certain "I told you so" smugness, however misplaced it may have been. While Meghan Markle likely viewed the palace's struggles as a vindication of her own complaints about the vipers in the British press, the reality was far more complex. The palace wasn't attacking Catherine, it was failing to defend her through its own incompetence. The contrast was stark. While the Sussexes thrive on a constant, hyper-controlled stream of self-promotion, the Waleses were drowning in a total lack of it, proving that both extremes are equally perilous for those born into the royal goldfish bowl. The dismissive, skeptical language often directed at Harry and Meghan in the UK began to shift slightly, not toward sympathy for them, but toward a broader, more biting cynicism toward the entire royal PR machine, which now seemed incapable of managing even the most basic of crisis communications. Behind the scenes, the pressure on the staff at Kensington Palace was becoming intolerable, as the well-meaning staff members who usually kept the wheels turning found themselves at the center of a global hurricane without a compass. They were fielding hundreds of calls an hour from international news desks, all asking the same impossible question: where is she? The internal monologue of a mid-level press officer during this time would have been one of sheer, unadulterated panic, knowing that any stray word could ignite a fresh firestorm, yet also knowing that saying nothing was fueling a conflagration. The atmosphere was one of a failing state, where the leadership is hunkered down in a bunker and the civil servants are left to face a mob that is growing more restless by the minute. This was not the smooth, professional operation the world had come to expect from the British royal family. It was a chaotic, amateurish scramble that suggested no one was actually in charge of the steering wheel. By the end of February, the Princess of Wales had ceased to be a person and had become a digital ghost, a Rorschach test for the world's anxieties and suspicions. The long-term damage to the brand of the perfect Middleton Wales family was already profound, as the image of the serene, unshakable Catherine was replaced by the image of a woman hidden away, possibly against her will, in a narrative straight out of a Victorian melodrama. The consequences of this vacuum were now irreversible. Even if she had walked out of Windsor Castle that afternoon and performed a cartwheel for the cameras, a significant portion of the public would have claimed it was a hologram or a high-end deepfake. The palace had waited too long to speak, and in doing so, they had allowed the truth to become irrelevant, replaced by a much more exciting and much more damaging collective hallucination. This was the grim reality as we entered the month of March. A monarchy under siege, not by Republican movements or political upheaval, but by its own inability to tell a credible story in the age of the algorithm. The stage was now set for the first sighting, a moment that should have brought relief but instead only added more fuel to the fire as the world prepared to witness the palace's most desperate attempt yet to regain control of a situation that was already hopelessly lost. We were no longer looking for a recovery. We were looking for proof of life, and the methods the palace would choose to provide that proof would soon become the biggest scandal in the history of royal photography. I have completed the second layer of this unraveling tale. The tension is mounting, the pixels are about to be pushed, and the amateur photographer is waiting in the wings. Right then, let us move into the murky waters of early March, a time when the suffocating silence from Windsor finally cracked, not with a dignified statement, but with a grainy, ambiguous image that felt more like a hostage proof of life than a royal update. You'll recall that Monday morning when the American tabloid TMZ published those long lens shots of Catherine in the passenger seat of an Audi driven by her mother, Kate Middleton, near Windsor Castle. It was a moment of profound, clumsy desperation, an attempt to douse the roaring flames of conspiracy with a thimble of murky water. Within the palace, the atmosphere was one of a failing garrison. The internal monologue of the senior staff must have been a frantic mix of, "at least they can see she's alive," and the gut-wrenching realization that they had completely lost control of the perimeter. This wasn't a curated appearance. It was a breach of the fortress, and the resulting image, blurry, somber, and utterly devoid of the usual Middleton polish, only served to deepen the global suspicion that something was being fundamentally hidden from us. The emotional weight of that morning must have been particularly crushing for Kate Middleton, a woman who has spent decades meticulously crafting the image of her family as the pinnacle of middle-class reliability and discreet grace. Imagine her internal monologue as she gripped that steering wheel, peering through the windscreen while acutely aware of the telephoto lenses trained on her daughter's pale, shadowed face. She wasn't just a grandmother on a school run. She'd been drafted into the front lines of a PR war, acting as a human shield for a daughter who looked, to any objective observer, entirely diminished by her ordeal. According to a well-meaning staff member, the mood at the breakfast table that morning was grim, a silent acknowledgement that the Middleton protection had been breached and that the princess's recovery was now being weaponized by the very press they had tried to shut out. The pressure on Carol, balancing her fierce maternal instincts against the cold, unfeeling demands of the crown's survival, must have been nothing short of agonizing. Surrounding this botched sighting was an atmosphere of total, unadulterated chaos within the Kensington Palace communications team, who were reportedly blindsided by the publication of the photos in the United States, while the British press, bound by a mix of gentlemen's agreements and fear of legal reprisal, initially looked the other way. This created a bizarre digital age schism. The rest of the world was staring at a photograph of the future queen looking exhausted and unrecognizable, while the British public was being told by their own media to move along. There's nothing to see here. The long-term consequence of this disparity was a massive, irreversible spike in distrust. It made the British press look like state-sponsored mouthpieces, and the palace look like they were hiding a Victorian invalid. It was a devastating blow to the flawless PR machine that William had built, exposing it as a reactive, panicked operation that couldn't even manage a simple drive to the shops without it looking like a scene from a conspiracy thriller. One cannot help but note the cynical parallels with the Sussexes, who have long complained about the invisible contract between the palace and the tabloids, a contract that seemed to be fraying into nothingness before our very eyes. While Harry and Meghan likely viewed this paparazzi intrusion as a vindication of their decision to flee to the manicured lawns of Montecito, the reality for Catherine was far more claustrophobic. She didn't have the luxury of a Netflix multi-million-dollar deal to tell her truth. She was trapped in the back of an Audi, a silent passenger in her own life, while the world debated whether the woman behind the sunglasses was even her at all. The skeptics, and I count myself among the more clear-eyed observers, noted that the photo did nothing to quell the rumors. In fact, the graininess and the strange lighting only fueled the body double theories that were now spreading like a virus through social media. The pressure cooker was now whistling with a high-pitched intensity that could no longer be ignored by the men in gray suits. They realized, far too late, that the public would not be satisfied with a blurry drive-by. They needed a signal, a grand gesture of normalcy to reset the narrative before the upcoming Commonwealth Day service. A well-placed source has suggested that the decision-making process during this week was marked by a dangerous kind of hubris, a belief that they could fix the optics with one definitive, heartwarming image that would remind the world why they loved Catherine in the first place. The internal monologue of the advisors was no longer about truth or transparency. It was about winning the weekend, a short-sighted goal that would lead directly to the most humiliating photographic scandal in the history of the monarchy. As we approached Mothering Sunday, the air around Windsor was thick with a manufactured, almost desperate optimism. The plan was simple: a domestic portrait, a candid moment of a mother with her children, captured by the Prince of Wales himself, to emphasize the intimacy and privacy they so cherished. But beneath that plan lay a terrifying reality. The princess was likely still too frail for a high-stakes photo shoot, and the pressure to produce perfection was so immense that it drove someone, be it a staffer or the princess herself in a moment of misguided helpfulness, to reach for the digital airbrush. The long-term consequence of this decision was the total annihilation of the palace's most valuable asset: its credibility. They weren't just editing a photograph, they were editing the public's perception of reality, and in doing so, they handed their critics the very noose that would be used to hang them. By the eve of Mother's Day, the image was ready, a digital Trojan horse designed to end the speculation once and for all. Little did they know that within hours of its release, the world's most sophisticated image verification software, and indeed the sharp eyes of millions of intelligent interlocutors, like yourselves, would be tearing that image apart, pixel by pixel. The palace had gambled everything on a single JPEG, and as we shall see in the next chapter of this sorry saga, they were about to lose the house. The atmosphere of quiet recovery was about to be shattered by a global kill notice that would change the monarchy forever. The stage is set for the pixels to bleed. The perfect family photo is about to become a crime scene of PR incompetence. The catastrophic decision to release the supposedly joyful, reassuring Mother's Day photograph on March 10th was born from a toxic mixture of institutional hubris and a frantic, localized desperation to silence the screaming headlines. One can only imagine the inner monologue of the senior PR advisors huddled in the sleek clinical offices of Kensington Palace, convinced that they had finally outsmarted the global mob with a single high-resolution JPEG. They believed, with an arrogance that can only be cultivated in the echo chambers of royal service, that a domestic tableau of the princess, surrounded by her 3 beaming children, would act as a universal reset button, instantly erasing months of dark speculation. There was a palpable sense of mission accomplished as the image was cleared for distribution, a belief that the sight of Catherine's smile would act as a powerful sedative for a public they clearly viewed as easily manipulated. This was the ultimate masterstroke, or so they thought, a rejection of the paparazzi's grainy intrusion in favor of a candid family moment captured by the Prince of Wales himself, emphasizing their control over their own narrative. Yet, the forced, manufactured joy depicted in that frame masked a surrounding atmosphere of extreme fragility and exhaustion behind the scenes at Adelaide Cottage. While the world saw a radiant mother in a rustic setting, the reality was likely a rushed, high-pressure photo shoot where a recovering woman was propped up to perform a version of herself that she wasn't yet ready to inhabit. According to a source behind closed doors, the atmosphere was far from the serene domesticity the photo suggested. It was a tense, calculated performance of domestic bliss, executed under the looming shadow of a global proof-of-life demand. The princess, still clearly in the delicate throes of a long recovery, was being used as the primary weapon in a PR counteroffensive, a role that must have felt like an intolerable burden while she was physically and emotionally depleted. The decision to release the photo without the usual rigorous checks by professional picture editors speaks to a breakdown in the chain of command, a moment where the desire for a quick win overrode the basic protocols of institutional integrity. The long-term consequences of this single upload are almost too vast to calculate, marking the precise moment the palace transitioned from being a respected source of historical record to a provider of questionable content. By releasing a heavily manipulated image into the digital bloodstream, they didn't just invite scrutiny, they invited a forensic autopsy of their honesty. The tragedy of the situation lies in the fact that the very instrument meant to heal the public rift, the image of the nurturing mother, became the very weapon that destroyed their credibility. Once the public realized they were being shown a digital composite rather than a documentary truth, the brand of William and Catherine as the authentic, relatable future of the monarchy was effectively poisoned. It was no longer about whether Catherine was ill. It was about whether anything the palace said could ever be believed again, creating a permanent, indelible stain on their reputation for plain speaking and transparency. One must also look at the cynical undercurrent regarding the Sussexes, who have often been accused of being the primary architects of fake narratives and staged publicity stunts. In this instance, the irony was thick enough to choke on. The steady, reliable Waleses had been caught in a deception far more amateurish and documentable than anything Harry and Meghan had ever been accused of. While the Montecito duo were likely observing the fallout with a predictable, quiet satisfaction, the British public was forced to confront the fact that their perfect royals were just as capable of airbrushing the truth as any Hollywood starlet. The dismissive tone often reserved for the Sussexes' PR games suddenly felt misplaced when the future king and queen were being labeled as peddlers of faked news by the world's most prestigious press agencies. This leveled the playing field in the most humiliating way possible, suggesting that the firm was just another group of influencers trying to filter their way out of a crisis. Behind the scenes, the immediate aftermath of the release felt like the calm before a devastating hurricane, as the communications team waited for the expected wave of adoring headlines that never quite materialized in the way they hoped. Instead of a collective sigh of relief, the intelligent interlocutors of the digital age began to zoom in, their internal monologues shifting from "she looks well" to "why is her sleeve missing a piece of itself?" A source within the inner circle has hinted that the initial pride felt by the staff quickly curdled into a cold, sinking dread as the first reports of manipulation began to trickle in from professional photography forums. The pressure cooker hadn't been vented, the lid had simply been screwed on tighter, and the internal pressure was reaching a point of total structural failure. They had gambled their most precious asset, public trust, on a single flawed masterstroke, and the House was about to call their bluff. The surrounding pressure from the international press corps was now morphing from curious to predatory, as the gentleman's agreement with the British media was bypassed by global agencies with no such loyalties. For these agencies, the sanctity of a royal handout was secondary to the integrity of their news feeds, and the realization that a trusted source had provided a compromised file was viewed as a professional insult. The atmosphere in the newsrooms of AP and Reuters was one of clinical efficiency, a stark contrast to the emotional panic within the palace. They weren't looking at a mother and her children, they were looking at a breach of ethics. This global scrutiny meant that the consequences of the Mother's Day masterstroke would not be confined to a few days of tabloid chatter, but would trigger a fundamental shift in how the international community viewed British royal communications moving forward. As the sun set on that ill-fated Mothering Sunday, the palace was still operating under the delusion that they could explain away the inconsistencies with a few minor clarifications. They failed to realize that they had crossed a Rubicon of digital trust that cannot be uncrossed. The perfect image had been exposed as a mirage, and the public's reaction was shifting from suspicion to an almost mocking derision. The stage was now set for the most humiliating 24 hours in the history of the Kensington Palace press office, a sequence of events that would see a future queen forced to apologize for her own family's incompetence. The masterstroke had become a self-inflicted wound, and the bleeding was only just beginning. The pixels have been scrutinized, and the verdict is coming in. The digital mask has slipped, and what lies beneath is far more complicated than a simple amateur hobbyist's mistake. The immediate forensic public scrutiny that followed the release of that Mothering Sunday portrait was nothing short of a digital bloodbath, as the collective eyes of millions of intelligent interlocutors tore the image apart within mere minutes. We watched in real time as the narrative of a serene recovery was dismantled, pixel by pixel, with amateur sleuths and professional editors alike pointing to the glaring, almost amateurish inconsistencies. The blurred, ghostly sleeve of Princess Charlotte's cardigan, the strangely misaligned zipper on Catherine's jacket, and, most tellingly, the conspicuous absence of that iconic sapphire engagement ring. The internal monologue of the public shifted instantly from relief to a cold, sharp-edged betrayal. It was no longer about how is she feeling, but rather, what on earth are they trying to hide? This wasn't just a case of a little digital smoothing. It was a patchwork quilt of a photograph that suggested the princess might not have even been present. For the moment the palace claimed to be documenting, the emotional impact on the public was a jarring transition from concern into a cynical, mocking disbelief that must have been devastating for the palace to witness. Imagine the atmosphere within the social media monitoring rooms at Kensington Palace as the tide turned with the speed of a summer gale, the perfect family image being mocked with memes and red-circled errors that highlighted their incompetence for all to see. The sheer, stomach-dropping realization that they had been caught red-handed in a deception, not just a white lie, but a verifiable photographic manipulation, must have left the staff in a state of catatonic shock. They had underestimated the forensic power of the internet, treating their global audience like a group of easily distracted children, only to find that the children were far better at spotting a fake than the highly paid advisors who had authorized the image's release. One cannot ignore the dismissive, almost weary sigh that surely echoed from the Sussexes' camp in Montecito as they watched their staid and reliable rivals implode with such spectacular lack of grace. While Harry and Meghan have frequently been criticized for their own carefully curated, high-gloss version of reality, they have never been caught so clumsily in the act of digital surgery on an official state portrait. The irony of the situation was almost farcical. The vipers in the press, whom William so often blames for his troubles, didn't need to lift a finger to destroy his family's credibility. The palace had done it for them with a few clumsy clicks of a mouse. This catastrophic error effectively neutralized the moral high ground that the Waleses had occupied since the fallout of Spare, reducing them to the same level of PR desperation and artifice that they have so frequently looked down upon in others. The surrounding atmosphere in the newsrooms of London and New York was one of feverish, manic energy, as journalists realized that the story was no longer the health of a princess, but the honesty of a crown. For the serious news agencies, the discovery of the manipulation was a professional crisis. A source behind closed doors has whispered that the internal monologue of the lead editors was one of pure, unadulterated fury at being used as a conduit for what looked like state-sponsored misinformation. The pressure on the palace to explain the missing ring and the phantom sleeve was reaching a crescendo that no amount of traditional stonewalling could hope to survive. Every pixel was now a witness to a potential cover-up, and the long-term consequences were beginning to crystallize. The monarchy had voluntarily entered the post-truth era, a place where their word was no longer bond, but merely a starting point for a debunking exercise. The psychological toll on Catherine during this forensic autopsy must have been profound, as she sat within her fortress of recovery and watched her very image being treated like a crime scene. We are talking about a woman who has spent over a decade perfecting the art of the flawless appearance, only to have her first official return to the public eye characterized by fakes and manipulation. The inner monologue of a recovering woman being scrutinized by the world's most cynical detectives would be one of profound isolation and a terrifying loss of agency. She had become a digital avatar to be manipulated by advisors, then shredded by the public. The atmosphere within the family must have been incredibly strained, as the protection William had promised had instead led her into a global humiliation of his own making. The consequences of this period are etched into the digital record forever. It was the moment the public learned to look at every royal release with a jaundiced eye. The illusion of royal perfection, so carefully maintained since the late 90s, was shattered by the very technology they thought would save them. The palace failed to realize that in the age of high-definition transparency, you cannot simply airbrush away a problem. You only succeed in making the problem more conspicuous. This wasn't just a PR blunder. It was a fundamental shift in the relationship between the crown and its subjects, moving from a position of trust but verify to one of assumed deception until proven otherwise. As the evening of that Mother's Day wore on, the pressure was no longer just from the internet sleuths, but from the institutional giants of the world's news infrastructure. The kill notice was looming, a nuclear option that no one in the palace's communications office truly believed would ever be deployed against the British royal family. The internal monologue of those in command was likely still one of arrogant dismissal, believing their prestige would shield them from accountability, even as the global news tickers were preparing to brand them as liars. The atmosphere was one of a slow-motion car crash, where everyone can see the impact coming, but no one has the courage to grab the wheel and steer away from the abyss. The stage was now set for the ultimate humiliation, a moment where the most prestigious news agencies in the world would turn their backs on the House of Windsor. The pixels had spoken, and they had declared the palace's narrative to be a hollow, edited shell of the truth. The digital guillotine is about to fall. The kill notice is being typed as we speak. The global kill notice was not merely a technical retraction. It was a public execution of the palace's reputation for honesty, delivered with the clinical coldness of a guillotine blade. We must understand that for institutions like the Associated Press, Reuters, and Agence France-Presse, their entire business model relies on the absolute integrity of the images they distribute, and to have a trusted source like the British royal family provide a tampered file is a professional insult of the highest order. The atmosphere across the global news desks that Sunday evening was one of stunned disbelief followed by a swift professional fury as editors realized they had been made complicit in a royal deception. One can imagine the internal monologue of a veteran picture editor at the AP, a person who has seen every kind of propaganda and war zone forgery, feeling a profound sense of betrayal that a future king's office would stoop to the level of a low-rent influencer. This was the precise moment the story transformed from a lighthearted "Where is Kate?" mystery into a serious international crisis concerning the transparency of the British state itself. Within the velvet-lined walls of the palace, the realization that the world's most powerful news agencies were turning their backs on them sent a wave of sheer, unadulterated terror through the ranks of the senior aides. A well-placed source has recounted the scene as one of absolute midnight panic, with men in gray suits scrambling to telephones, their voices hushed but thick with the realization that their arrogant gamble had backfired spectacularly. The internal monologue of those in command was no longer about protecting the princess's privacy. It was a desperate, primal urge for institutional survival as they watched their international allies publicly brand them as peddlers of fake news. The pressure in those rooms must have been suffocating, a toxic mix of sweat and high-grade stationery, as the realization set in that no amount of royal prestige could stop the relentless ticker tape of the global news cycle. They had spent decades building a fortress of respectability, only to watch the gates being kicked open by a few poorly edited pixels and a mandatory kill instruction that would be archived in history books forever. The surrounding pressure from international allies, particularly in Washington and Paris, added a layer of geopolitical embarrassment that made the situation feel like a crumbling of the old guard. For the British royal family to be relegated to the status of a non-trusted source, a category usually reserved for rogue states and third-tier propaganda machines, was a humiliation that resonated far beyond the gossip columns. The long-term consequences of this downgrade are catastrophic, as every future image released by the palace will now be subjected to a level of forensic scrutiny that borders on the antagonistic. This wasn't just about a Mother's Day photo, it was about the fundamental erosion of the magic of the monarchy, replaced by a cold, hard requirement for digital verification. The atmosphere of quiet, dignified authority that usually surrounds the crown was replaced by the frantic, undignified energy of a corporate PR department caught in a massive fraud, leaving the public to wonder if anything they had seen for the last decade was actually real. Even the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, despite their own tiresome penchant for melodrama and their relentless self-serving narratives, have rarely managed to be this institutional in their failure. While one might look at Harry and Meghan's Hollywood-style PR with a healthy dose of skepticism, at least they operate within the expected norms of celebrity artifice. The Waleses, conversely, were supposed to be the gold standard of constitutional reliability. The irony of the situation is quite biting, as the very people who have spent years briefing against the Sussexes for being unreliable were now the ones being blacklisted by the world's most prestigious news agencies. One can almost hear the cynical laughter echoing from Montecito, not out of malice perhaps, but out of the simple realization that the professionals back in London were just as capable of making a hash of things as anyone else. This leveled the playing field in the most damaging way possible, suggesting that the entire royal apparatus was now more interested in winning the news cycle than in telling the simple, unvarnished truth. The long-term damage to the brand of the firm is perhaps most evident in the way the international press now treats every royal statement with the same suspicion they would afford a press release from a tech giant or a disgraced politician. The atmosphere of blind public deference has been replaced by a sharp collective intake of breath every time a new photograph is released, as if the world is waiting for the next pixel to drop. This kill notice was the final nail in the coffin of the old way of doing things, proving that in the digital age, being a future king does not grant you an exemption from the rules of evidence. The consequences will be felt for a generation as the monarchy is forced to navigate a world where they are no longer the arbiters of their own reality, but are instead subject to the same brutal fact-checking scrutiny as the rest of the common world. They have lost the benefit of the doubt, and in the business of royalty, the doubt is the one thing you can never afford to have people feel. As the dust began to settle on that historic night of humiliation, the focus within the palace shifted from trying to save the image to finding someone to take the blame for the disaster. The internal monologue of the senior advisors was shifting toward a cold, calculating necessity. A scapegoat was required to satisfy the baying mob and to allow the Prince of Wales to distance himself from the wreckage. The atmosphere was no longer one of collective panic, but of a chilling clinical search for a sacrificial lamb who could be offered up to the press to stop the bleeding. It was becoming increasingly clear that the prince's own image was too valuable to be tarnished by such an amateurish mistake, leaving only one person left in the crosshairs. The stage was being set for a move so cynical and so desperate that it would shock even the most hardened observers of the royal court. The international wires have gone quiet, but the internal knives are being sharpened. The kill notice has done its work, and now the palace must decide who dies on this particular PR hill. The shocking, deeply cynical official statement released the following morning was a moment of institutional cowardice that will likely be studied by PR students for decades to come. As a recovering, Catherine was forced to take the sole blame for the entire debacle. We watched with a mixture of disbelief and a rather cold, biting pity as the Princess of Wales, a woman still presumably in the delicate throes of a significant medical recovery, was made to issue a personal apology, describing herself as an amateur photographer who occasionally experiments with editing. The internal monologue of the senior advisors who drafted that tweet must have been one of ruthless, cold-blooded pragmatism. They knew they had to stop the global bleeding, and they decided the most effective bandage was to throw the future queen under the proverbial royal bus. There was no mention of the multi-million-pound communications apparatus that should have vetted the image, nor of the Prince of Wales, who was officially credited with taking the photograph in the first place. Instead, the palace chose to hide behind the skirts of a convalescing mother, prioritizing the perfection of the male heir over the dignity and well-being of his wife. The atmosphere within the family's private quarters at Adelaide Cottage must have been one of profound, aching isolation, as Catherine realized that the protection she had been promised by the institution was essentially a hollowed-out myth. Imagine the sheer, exhausting pressure of being the world's most scrutinized woman, already physically depleted, and then having to sign off on a statement that effectively branded you a liar to save the faces of the men in gray suits. According to a longtime family acquaintance, the mood was one of quiet, bitter dismay, with the realization sinking in that the crown's survival instinct always, invariably, trumps personal loyalty. The princess was being asked to perform one final humiliating act of service, to act as a lightning rod for the world's mockery so that the monarchy itself could limp forward. It was a staggering betrayal of the partnership that William and Catherine have spent years presenting as the rock-solid foundation of the modern firm, exposing a hierarchy that is as rigid and unforgiving as it was in the days of the Tudors. The long-term consequences of this amateur photographer defense are etched into the public consciousness as a moment where the mask of the protective husband truly slipped for Prince William. For years, he has cultivated an image as the fierce, uncompromising guardian of his family's privacy. Yet when the chips were down and the global press was baying for blood, he allowed his wife to stand alone in the firing line. This has created an indelible stain on his personal brand, suggesting a certain chilling calculation that many found deeply unpalatable. It wasn't just a PR blunder, it was a character reveal that the public will not soon forget. The surrounding atmosphere of the British public shifted from sympathy for a sick woman to an uneasy, simmering resentment toward the men who had allowed her to take the fall. This was the moment the fairy tale marriage was replaced in the public imagination by a much more transactional, almost corporate arrangement, where the principal's reputation is shielded at any cost, regardless of the human toll. One cannot help but contrast this with the relentless, if often tiresome, me against the world narrative of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, who have built their entire post-royal identity on the idea of protecting one another from the institution. While we may view Harry and Meghan's constant grievances with a healthy dose of skepticism, the sight of Catherine being hung out to dry by Kensington Palace lent an uncomfortable amount of weight to the Sussexes' claims about the vipers within the palace walls. The irony is quite sharp. By trying to appear normal and relatable with a bit of amateur photo editing, the Waleses accidentally proved every dark rumor about the cold, calculating nature of royal life. The dismissive tone often used for the Sussexes' dramatic exits suddenly felt a little less certain when the world saw exactly what happens to a loyal, perfect royal when the PR machine needs a sacrificial lamb. Behind the scenes, the well-meaning staff members, who had been part of the initial cover-up, were likely breathing a sigh of relief, though the air in the press office remained thick with the stench of a managed disaster. The internal monologue of a junior staffer would be one of profound disillusionment, seeing firsthand how quickly the firm will discard even its most valuable members to maintain the illusion of institutional infallibility. The pressure from the international media didn't dissipate with the apology. It merely changed shape, moving from, "Is she alive?" to, "Why are you treating her like this?" This shift in the narrative was perhaps the most damaging of all, as it turned the Princess of Wales into a figure of pity rather than one of aspiration, a catastrophic downgrade for a woman who is supposed to be the jewel in the Windsor crown. The surrounding pressure on the royal family to be authentic has now become an impossible standard, as every future attempt at a candid moment will be viewed through the lens of this profound deception. The consequence of the scapegoat strategy is that the public no longer sees Catherine as a participant in her own public life, but as a puppet whose strings are being pulled by an increasingly desperate and incompetent set of handlers. The atmosphere of trust that once defined the relationship between the Waleses and their supporters has been replaced by a weary, jaundiced eye that looks for the edit in every statement and the hidden hand in every photograph. They didn't just sacrifice Catherine's reputation that morning. They sacrificed the very idea that the royal family is a family at all, rather than a cold-blooded branding exercise. As we move into the final reckoning of this saga, the realization is settling in that the perfect Middleton Wales era has ended, replaced by something much more fragile and much less believable. The internal knives may have been put away for now, but the scars on the princess's public image, and perhaps her private trust, are permanent. The stage is set for the final chapter, where we must confront the shattered remains of the royal illusion and the grim reality of a monarchy that has lost its most precious asset: the benefit of the doubt. The apology was issued, the blame was assigned, but the world isn't buying the amateur hobbyist story for a single second. The final reckoning is upon us. The long-term fallout of the Mother's Day photo scandal, followed by that curiously staged Windsor farm shop video, has signaled the definitive end of an era for the British monarchy, the era of unquestioned, polished perfection. We are witnessing the irreversible death of blind public deference, replaced by a sharp collective skepticism that treats every royal communication as a potential high-end deepfake or a calculated piece of misdirection. One can only imagine the heavy, melancholic resignation within the private chambers of Adelaide Cottage, where the Prince and Princess of Wales must surely realize that their happily ever after brand has been permanently replaced by a narrative of guilty until proven innocent. The internal monologue of a woman who was once the most trusted figure in the firm must be one of profound, stinging betrayal. She lived a double life of impeccable service for over a decade, only to be cast as a deceptive amateur the moment the institutional machinery faltered. The atmosphere surrounding the Waleses is no longer one of sunny aspirational domesticity, but rather a twilight of suspicion, where even a simple walk to a farm shop is subjected to the kind of forensic frame-by-frame analysis usually reserved for Zapruder-style conspiracy theories. The surrounding pressure on the palace to reclaim its truth has led to a series of increasingly frantic maneuvers that have only served to cement the public's new, jaundiced perspective. When the subsequent video surfaced of William and Catherine at a local farm shop, a moment that should have been a triumphant return to normalcy, it was met with a wall of cynical, mocking disbelief from a public that had been once bitten and was now twice shy. According to a source within the inner circle, the sheer, unadulterated frustration felt by Prince William was palpable. He had tried to give the world authenticity, yet the world now assumed every movement was a body double or a hologram. The long-term consequence of this shift is that the crown has lost the ability to control its own history. The digital age has democratized skepticism, and no amount of royal lineage can shield an individual from the intelligent interlocutors who now demand verifiable proof for every claim. The atmosphere of the Windsor estate, once a sanctuary of private recovery, has been transformed into a gilded panopticon where the princess is perpetually missing, even when she is standing right in front of the lens. The psychological toll of this shattered illusion is perhaps most evident in the chilling reality of living a life that is assumed to be a lie, a burden that would buckle the strongest of spirits. For Catherine, the transition from the nation's sweetheart to a figure of global proof-of-life speculation has been a brutal, transformative experience that likely leaves her feeling like a ghost in her own story. One can almost hear the hushed, anxious conversations behind closed doors, the realization that the old PR playbook, the one that relied on the dignity of silence and the power of a single authorized image, is not just outdated, but actively dangerous. The consequence of their scapegoat strategy in Part 7 has been a permanent fracturing of the emotional bond between the princess and her most loyal supporters, who now see her not as a powerful future queen, but as a vulnerable woman trapped within a cold, calculating system. This isn't just a breakdown in PR. It is a fundamental shift in the soul of the monarchy, proving that the magic of the crown cannot survive the harsh, unfeeling light of a digital autopsy. Even the relentless, self-serving antics of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex across the Atlantic now seem almost pedestrian compared to the institutional self-sabotage we have witnessed from the reliable branch of the family. While we may continue to view Harry and Meghan's Hollywood posturing with a healthy dose of skepticism, they at least have the excuse of being outsiders. The Waleses were the very heart of the establishment, and their failure is an indictment of the system itself. The dismissive language once reserved for the Montecito duo is now being redirected toward the men in gray suits at Kensington Palace, who have proven themselves to be utterly out of their depth in the face of modern scrutiny. The long-term damage to the Windsor legacy is that the perfect family is no longer believable, and in the business of royalty, if you are not believable, you are eventually irrelevant. The atmosphere of the entire institution has been tainted by this aura of deception, leaving a cynical public to wonder what other truths have been airbrushed out of the royal record over the past 70 years. The final reckoning for the House of Windsor is the realization that they are no longer the masters of their own image, but are instead subjects of a global, decentralized news cycle that values transparency over tradition. The consequences of this photographic scandal will be felt for generations, as every future royal milestone will be greeted with a request for the original raw file rather than a respectful nod of the head. The atmosphere of blind deference is dead and buried, replaced by a sharp clinical requirement for evidence that the monarchy is simply not equipped to provide. They have entered a new, much more perilous chapter of their history, one where the mystery of the crown has been replaced by the misinformation of the palace, a transition that threatens the very foundations of their survival. The amateur photographer apology was the moment the music stopped, and as the lights come up on the modern monarchy, we are left looking at a family that is just as flawed, just as panicked, and just as desperate as the rest of humanity, only with much more expensive wallpaper. As we conclude this unvarnished look at the most significant royal crisis of the century, we are left with the sobering thought that the monarchy's greatest threat was never a Republican movement or a political scandal, but its own inability to tell the truth in a world that can no longer be lied to. The gravity of the situation is profound. Once the benefit of the doubt is lost, it is almost impossible to regain, and the House of Windsor is now operating on a deficit of trust that may never be repaid. The disappearing princess was merely the catalyst for a much larger unraveling, a moment where the digital age finally caught up with a medieval institution and demanded an accounting that it was unable to give. We must now watch as they attempt to rebuild their shattered credibility, knowing all the while that the perfect image they once projected was always just a carefully edited mirage. The silence has been broken, the pixels have been exposed, and the truth, however uncomfortable, is all that remains. Leave your thoughts below. I read every word you write, and I am genuinely curious to see if you believe the palace can ever truly recover from this self-inflicted wound. If you value this unvarnished, perhaps slightly cynical look at the mechanics of the monarchy, do ensure you are subscribed and share this with those who appreciate the truth over the filtered facade. We shall continue to watch the gates of Windsor, but from now on, we shall be looking much, much closer at the shadows. Until next time.